All right, well, we'll go ahead and get started. So, hello and welcome. My name is Mallory DeMay, and I am a faculty support and classroom consultant and the host for this session, Conceptualizing and Operationalizing the Key Constructs of Dimensions of Belonging in Online Higher Education. By joining us today, you acknowledge that this session is being recorded and will be shared with TLC-related materials. Microphones will be muted for this presentation, but we encourage you to post questions and comments in the chat, which will be addressed during the Q&A portion at the end of the session. Also, we have enabled live transcription. If you would like to use it, click the Show Captions button at the bottom of your Zoom window. Now, I'm pleased to introduce you to Dr. Yolanda Harper, Program Chair and Professor in the Department of Behavioral Sciences for the College of Arts and Sciences at UAGC, Dr. Stephanie Stubbs, Associate Director in the Department of Graduate Studies and Research at UAGC, and Dr. Dan Augusto, Program Chair and Assistant Professor for the Department of Behavioral Sciences for the College of Arts and Sciences at UAGC. So I will let you guys take it over.
Thank you, Mallory. So we're going to start with a water cooler conversation.
What a timely topic. You know, studies show improving student sense of belonging positively impacts a variety of student outcomes.
Really? Like what?
Like increased engagement?
And academic performance, which includes better grades, persistence, retention, and completion rates.
And also personal growth and well-being.
Wait. Hold on. Personal growth and well-being. Like we're a university, not a psychiatric hospital.
We're just telling you what's in the literature.
And I'm just telling you this belonging topic, theme, construct, whatever you want to call it, it's ambiguous. What does improving student sense of belonging even mean?
Well, yes, defining belonging can be challenging, and certainly there is ambiguity about the definition and measurement of sense of belonging.
I mean, how's supporting belonging like any different than what we've always done though? Like letting students know they're welcome.
Well, that's certainly part of it. And another part of it is working to enhance student engagement and ensure that no one feels excluded.
OMG, I can't believe you used the F word.
The F word?
Feel, as in feelings. That's exactly why it's so hard to define and measure.
Oh, perhaps. But another challenge is that the boundaries of belonging keep growing. You know, I overheard a colleague say that they think belonging is just a code word to circumvent backlash in response to diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives.
I can see that being necessary in some contexts. Since belonging is assumed to be a universal human need, it's less controversial, less political than the DEI language that some states have labeled as being too divisive.
Yeah, I mean, that's all well and good, but I mean, hello, psychology 101. We aren't responsible for anyone's feelings but our own. You know, people are paying therapists $150 an hour to learn that. So why are we trying to control how students feel? Seriously.
Well, to quote Strayhorn, we can't make you feel a sense of belonging, but we can create the conditions where the likelihood that you will feel a sense of belonging are greatest.
Well, I got 3 words for you and your friend Strayhorn. Ambiguous, nebulous, squishy.
And that's our water cooler conversation for today. So welcome to our session officially. And let me get my regular face back for you all. As Dan and Stephanie and I discussed the definitions, dimensions, and operationalizations of belonging, we invite you to reflect on these questions that we'll revisit again toward the end of our session. The first question acknowledges some dimensions of belonging are easier to operationalize in a meaningful way for online students than others. Once we decide on the meaningful dimensions, the second question asks us to consider how are we actually going to measure belonging? And then once we've defined measured, what type of data is relevant for decision-making to truly impact students' sense of belonging? Now, as illustrated in the opening dialogue, sometimes the most basic concepts that are commonly experienced can be the most challenging to define. And even when defined, differences of opinion will remain regarding the relevance of the definitions across different contexts, or even if the construct is worth giving any attention to at all. But assuming that most, if not all of us here, agree that the construct of belonging is at least worth giving attention to, which definition will be best for our particular context? Now, Diaz and Braun and colleagues investigated how students' sense of belonging in higher education is defined and measured. And they identified 52 separate sense of belonging measures utilized in 155 studies published between 2000 and 2021. Well, spoiler alert, there is no consensus in the higher education literature about how students' sense of belonging should be defined and measured. But that being said, reflect on your own institution, your department, and your students, and take note of which themes you would include in a definition of belonging. Here are some of the key concepts frequently mentioned in definitions of sense of belonging in higher education, based on the types of studies. In quantitative and mixed method studies, we see terms like acceptance, connectedness, support, respect, inclusion, importance, mattering, being or feeling a part of, and fitting in. In qualitative studies, we find concepts frequently found in the quantitative and mixed method studies, plus additional concepts that reflect what the students bring to or get from higher education. Now, as you look at these lists, which concepts would you include in a definition of belonging for students at your institution or in your department? Are there terms that you would add that aren't listed here? Would you have a different definition for belonging as it relates to faculty and staff? Why or why not? Now, please share your thoughts to some of these questions in the chat as we look at some of the more frequently cited definitions in the literature. Now, here we have 6 frequently cited definitions, and I will share their sources on the next slide. But for now, we're going to put up a poll and ask you to vote. Hey, on voting day, how convenient is that? For which definition you feel best fits the students in your university context or your department. So, Mallory, if you would put up the poll and.
Yeah, I actually put it in the chat because the polling, the feature isn't working at the moment. So I put the question and the options in the chat for everybody.
Okay. All right. So we won't be able to see unless you can do a quick tally. Someone else can do a quick tally of which definition is most popular.
Okay.
We'll give a few minutes. Do we have any preferences showing up yet?
So I have one vote of the number 5 option right now. Okay, someone voted for number 4. Number 3.
Wow, just like in the literature, right? Different contexts, different perspectives, different preferences.
Now we have a 1.
All right.
I'm going to vote for 2 just to round it all out.
I felt like I needed to be an auctioneer. Do I hear 2? Do I hear 2? Anybody hear 2? Okay, well, thank you all. And of course, you can continue to share your thoughts about that. So since you put the definitions in the chat, I did want to make sure that you also had the sources for these different definitions as well. And we'll also provide a list of references so you can connect these citations to the definitions and sources at the end. And with that, I'll hand it over to Stephanie, who will talk about dimensions of belonging.
Thank you. Next slide. Considering the various definitions outlined previously, and especially the many different definitions that we all chose to prefer, it's clear that belonging is not a singular construct, but rather one that is composed of many dimensions. Researchers have conceptualized belonging in many ways. The model that's highlighted on this slide, outlined by Carter and colleagues, identifies 10 primary dimensions divided into 5 steps, illustrating a trajectory in which the individual moves toward a complete experience of belonging. Next slide. In the first step, choosing, the parties involved make a mutual choice. The individual is present by invitation. This mutual step toward a healthy connection is the basis of an authentic relationship and forms the foundation for a true sense of belonging. The second step in the process involves investment, a welcoming environment in which the individual is known as an individual with unique qualities, affirms their value, and invites further engagement. Step 3 encompasses the dimensions of acceptance and support. At this phase, yielding to one another, whether a relationship between individuals or the individual within an organization, fosters a deeper relationship. In the fourth step, commitment to maintaining the relationship creates a safe space in which the individual feels heard and befriended. In this phase, trust develops. The final 5th step leads to flourishing. The individual may experience a complete sense of belonging when they feel needed and loved, and this will promote thriving within the situation. Next slide. Existing literature in higher education emphasizes 2 domains in which belongingness resides, identifying academic and social engagement as key contributors to the student experience of belonging. Indeed, students frequently discuss the various dimensions of belonging outlined on the previous slide within these domains. Students may indicate feelings of engagement in the classroom when an instructor welcomes them, or support from peers in a less formal, more social setting like a student group or club. Next slide. However, Ahn and Davis reference 2 additional domains that may impact students' sense of belonging: surroundings and personal space. Surroundings include the immediate living spaces, geographical location, and cultural milieu in which a student occupies. And personal space encompasses elements such as life satisfaction, attitudes, identities, and interests. For students in an online setting, like our students here at UAGC, there's obviously much greater variation in the surroundings and personal space, which challenges us as educators to consider the multidimensionality of their experience in order to build a sense of belonging. Next slide, please. One seminal model that allows us to put these various domains into perspective is that of Bronfenbrenner, considering ecological systems. And Dr. Packard outlined this in the opening session today, which was a nice preview. The individual exists within a microsystem, the immediate environment, including personal space and surroundings, family, peers, even school and the workplace. The microsystem is embedded within the mesosystem, which includes connections between environments. The mesosystem is the immediate environment in which that direct interaction occurs. Encompassing the meso and microsystems is the exosystem, the indirect environment, economic, political, educational, governmental, and even religious systems. And finally, the macrosystem, or the more broad social and cultural forces, values, norms, and customs that overarch all of daily life. Encompassing all of this is the chronosystem, considering the role of time in development, life transitions, historical events, and societal changes. All of these things are having an impact on the individual in that situation as they are building that sense of belonging. Next slide. Simplifying this just a little, consider the individual embedded within a network of interpersonal relationships encompassed by institutional settings, as illustrated in the figure on this slide. A sense of belonging composed on multiple dimensions can be fostered at each level by recognition of the individual through fostering interpersonal connections and enacting supportive policies at the institutional level. Next slide. Taking this one step further is the bioecological model, which separates the person, process, and context, illustrated in the figure on this slide. The person is influenced by demand characteristics, such as preconceived notions, resource characteristics, such as skills, experiences, abilities, and resources, and force characteristics, such as personality and motivation. One can imagine the various demands, resources, and forces exerted upon students as they interact with us, and the challenges this may pose toward developing that deepened sense of belonging. Process involves the repeated and progressively more complex interactions between people and with objects. And finally, context, as illustrated by Bronfenbrenner's socio-ecological systems. Next slide. Yet another dimension to consider when placing the individual in context is spatial belonging. Wong emphasizes the potential disconnect between conceived, perceived, and lived spaces, arguing that an awareness of the spatial influences on belonging provide perspective from which we can more fully appreciate the multidimensionality of our students' experiences and the variation depending upon their backgrounds. In the figure displayed here, notice the overlap between physical and digital spaces. Physical space includes the material and tangible aspects of reality, so things like buildings. But for students pursuing education online, the digital space takes precedence. This includes virtual realms constructed and accessed through technology, internet, including websites, social media, platforms, and tools, all of the things that we're dealing with on a daily basis. Relational space encompasses the connections between people, and structural space references the societal structures and dominant discourse. So things like historical and political ideologies, processes and practices, and the like. Next slide. Now that we've explored the various dimensions of belonging and conceptualizations of the individual in relationship to the environment, let's take just a moment to consider the multiple dimensions of our students. How an individual reacts to and engages with other individuals and the situation will be influenced by the many elements of personal and social identity. The student body here at UAGC, for instance, is geographically very diverse, as you can see from the statistics here on the slide, with large segments from the South and West, as well as sizable contingents from the Midwest and Northeast, diverse ethnic and gender backgrounds as well. Next slide. But wait, that's not all. A vast majority of our students are adults over the age of 25, half are Pell Grant recipients, and a quarter are associated with the military. We began this segment of the presentation considering the many dimensions of belonging, and I'd like to conclude asking another question. How do students from different backgrounds experience belongingness differently? To choosing and investing in our students, yielding and committing to their needs, we can best and better support their belonging and flourishing when we recognize their individuality. And now, next slide, I'd like to turn it over to Dan to talk about how we can operationalize those many dimensions.
Okay, unfortunately, I don't have an answer on how we can operationalize the dimensions, but I have a little bit of information on how other people are starting to do that process a little bit. Okay, so if we go to the next slide, cool. So the starting foundation of this is that the idea of belonging, it's conceptualized based on the relationship between the student and the institution, as Stephanie and Yolanda have discussed before. But why do we even care? Belonging is needed we have to support the risk-taking and vulnerability that's necessary to actually learn something, right? As students, they have to be willing to do that. And so belonging needs to be there for that to happen. Otherwise, we're on transmit only, basically. In a practical sense, the institution needs belonging, because otherwise, if students don't feel like they belong, they just won't stay there, right? So that's one layer of the foundation here for my little research, literature review type thing I've done here. But the next thing down is that it follows that to define belonging, or to identify or define any of the dimensions of belonging, or to even try to operationalize or measure those dimensions, anything we do, it has to be aimed at the relationship between the student and the institution. So those are my givens that I used as I started my little process here. We're trying to figure out what the research is showing on this. If we can go to the next slide. So just a refresher on operationalization. We're basically taking something that's a concept. We've been talking about a lot of conceptual stuff. I heard the word milieu in there at one point. Really conceptual, kind of squishy things we're talking about. When you take and operationalize that, you take that and you turn it into something to be measured or compared against something else, analyzed in the research. So that's what we talk when we say operationalization. As an example, I'm in the criminal justice, homeland security world. We look at things like crime, right? Crime as a concept, just this general sense of crime, whether it's increasing or decreasing. If you're doing research on that, you might operationalize that by using the FBI Uniform Crime Reports or the NIBRS database that they have, where they collect all the information on crime. That database has information on the specific crimes that categorizes them, whether felonies or misdemeanors, whether index crimes or another kind of crime. And so it's put into a package that we can use and compare and look for connections and correlations and whatnot. There's a lot of disagreement on even the purposes on these dimensions of belonging. Okay, we're not even, as you'll see in the next slide, the dimensions themselves there's no agreement on, but researchers don't seem to even agree on what a dimension is and how it supports belonging. Some of the researchers, for instance, Allen et al., they used what they did with it in their interpretation. A dimension was almost, you got these items that are there, but even if they're all there, it doesn't necessarily mean belonging is going to occur, right? Other researchers have used, once all of these dimensions of belonging are present, then belonging is present. So that's two different ways of looking at these dimensions. And there's not even agreement on that. Like, what does a dimension even do under belonging? And so, as you can guess, it's going to get ugly in a second when we talk about the actual dimensions themselves. So we can go on to the next slide. I don't expect anybody to fully look at this table, but the idea here is, if you look on the far left, that I believe that there's 17 or 18 dimensions of belonging that I have identified in a really brief literature review that I did just on higher education research in the last couple of years. And so you'll look at articles and the researcher will say, there's 4 dimensions of belonging. But then when you look at other articles, they'll say something else and something else. And so eventually I was just able to find almost 18 of these just off my own review. But then other researchers will say there's 4 dimensions of belonging. But this is kind of standard for any kind of body of work that's advancing. If it's in its initial stages, there's no agreement. And it eventually kind of constricts itself. And eventually, hopefully in a couple decades, there will be 4 or 5 dimensions of belonging that most researchers, or many researchers, agree on, right? But this is where we're at. This is more of a reflection of the state of things with this body of work. Now, there's also a lot of overlap. So not only is there disagreement, but there's overlap. So if you look at the first item I mentioned on the very top, we got the physical belonging. According to this researcher, Diaz, on 2022, she mentioned physical as one element of belonging, but there's overlap with far right. You'll see the word surroundings there. That means another researcher used the term surroundings to reflect. So a lot of that needs to happen, and this will kind of pare itself down as time goes on. But this makes it really hard to operationalize anything or look for themes because there's no agreement yet, but that's natural. Okay, next slide. In terms of measurement and operationalization, Dr. Harper mentioned some of this before. Qualitative studies that I looked at, they basically found that they're really useful in defining it. This is what qualitative research is. Very good at defining it, identifying the sort of a diversity of the responses and the context behind what it is, how people define it. So it's really good for qualitative research, good for defining it, not for looking for any correlations, any relationships, anything like that, or measuring a thing, right? That's not really how qualitative research is usually used, right? The quantitative studies I looked at showed that the dimensions of belonging that were identified, with the understanding there's no agreement on the dimensions, but the dimensions that were used tended to act as a mediator variable toward engagement as another variable. So that's something else to consider in terms of how it was actually, what was actually operationalized in surveys, as well as there's a 10-word question tool that was pretty interesting, and there's other items like that out there that were used to collect that information. But my personal interpretation of where the body of work is right now is that qualitative studies should be the focus for the next few years because they're still trying to define this thing. If you're not even agreeing on the dimensions or what they even do, then I think qualitative, we refocus on that, then quantitative studies can support that later on, but there needs to be some more agreement and parameters set around this for later quantitative research. That's just my own opinion, but nobody asked me. I'm just telling you. So this is the only way to get my opinion out, is by saying it. So the final thing I mentioned, one interesting thing I saw in the research was that some researchers are taking an approach of looking for the absence of a thing to show belonging or dimension of belonging. So by that, I mean, let's say students reported the absence of loneliness, right? That in reverse, they use that as a reflection of one part of a dimension of belonging. So it was really interesting. That's not something we do in my area, is look for the absence of something, like the absence of fear, equaling something else. And so that's something to keep in mind. It was really interesting as y'all look into this. So next slide. So some of the takeaways for us is that there's a structure there. There's a basic foundation there for these elements of belonging and what belonging is, but a lot of further research and further details are needed. I think we need more research to identify what data sets might be useful, and particularly finding what pieces of data are correlated with one or more dimension of belonging. And measuring those dimensions, again, should be about that dimension's role in increasing the student's relationship with the institution. So you've got to find pieces of data that are gonna be good proxies for that. And that's challenging because we don't even agree on the first part at this point with where the research at. Some considerations are the student's role, the institution's role as well. Keeping in mind that just the student has to want to belong. And that was mentioned earlier, or alluded to at least, is that the student has to want to belong too. They have a role in it too. So their role is really important as well. But then there's the role, of course. And then another thing to consider and keep in mind was the thing I mentioned earlier about the negative or absence-focused design in collecting information that might reflect it, even though it's an absence of a thing. So hopefully that makes some sense. Next slide. Some considerations for our attempts to locate or operationalize belonging dimensions. Since there's no agreement among researchers, we're going to have to consider things like what kind of data can we find that reflect any of these potential dimensions. I showed 18. I'm sure there's a lot more. So kind of be willing to say, well, here's a data set that might reflect this dimension as one researcher designed it or defined it. It doesn't have to be agreement on that. We don't have to get all of it. We found something that connects back to one of these dimensions. This might be something to look at and keep it. So regardless of the agreement out there on whether that dimension is truly the final landing place that they get to, because you'd have to wait 2 or 3 decades to get there. So you may find accessible data on some dimensions, but not others is another point. So just be willing to accept that we have some data on this one dimension that one researcher found. We're going to go with that for now, right? Just be willing to accept that. Don't wait 3 decades. Cherry picking dimensions that most apply to your institution. Probably something you have to accept. In research, cherry picking is a bad thing, but in this sense, when we're talking about advancing your own organization, doing organizational research to benefit your organization, your students, we're talking about you have to be kind of willing to take what you can get and understand that we've got data that reflect one part of one dimension of belonging because that's what we've got, and so doesn't reflect the totality of belonging as a concept. But with that, if we're accepting that we're going to cherry pick in that sense, cherry pick based on data availability, we have to really be clear. If you're doing internal organizational research, trying to benefit your organization, be clear about the limitations, delimitations, and gaps in your internal inquiry. Don't make it very clear that this is not something that's necessarily generalizable to the broader body of work or a bigger population. You're using it to benefit your organization and your students, and so you're accepting a narrow piece of data. So that's a thought. Next slide, related specifically to UAGC and what I see for what I view as opportunities at UAGC is, to me, the big thing that popped out was the nexus to our care. It almost can't be separated. And I think further research is needed to examine if there's an interrelationship. It's telling me my connection's unstable. Is it cutting out, or are you picking me up?
You're cutting out a little bit, but I'm able to catch most of what you're saying. But you could always try. If it stays unstable, you can turn off your video. That sometimes helps free bandwidth.
All right, someone give me a hand signal if it does that, and then I'll just turn it off. But in terms of, I think further relationship is needed on whether there's an interrelationship between what we call culture care or care-based initiatives and that concept of belong. I personally wouldn't be shocked to see if we eventually find out that our culture of care, this whole big initiative we have, is one aspect under the bigger umbrella of one dimension of the bigger umbrella of belonging. And like everything we're doing under the culture of care may turn out to be one part of that bigger belonging concept. We also want to look for any connections between the care's pillars and those dimensions of belonging. And so that also means that we need to consider, and this ties to the final bullet, we need to consider the language we're using to define cares and our cares pillars, and how that may or may not reflect at all what the research shows in that belonging body of work. We may need to really reconsider the terms we're using for our CARES pillars and maybe even redefine them or rework them to be more congruent with that body of work under the belonging body of work. We may find that we're using a term, C for communication, and under a dimension of belonging, that's actually something else that everybody else is using. And so as we look forward to possibly doing this potential culture of care research center, these are the kind of things that we may have to be aware of, that our definition may not match the body of work, and we may need to come along to that, particularly within that culture of care research context. So that's the final part for that slide. If you want to go to the next slide. We are now at the part where we don't have to talk as much, and then y'all hopefully have to talk a little more in the audience. We've got some discussion questions that we're going to throw out there, and if people can come off of mute and come off of the video, or come onto the video, or however you want to do it. You can go in the chat room as well. We've got some discussion questions we want to throw out there to the audience and see what if they have any thoughts on that. The first question is, which dimensions of belonging can be operationalized and leveraged in your institution, in your context, to provide a meaningful benefit? So basically, which dimensions do you think you could leverage in your context and could actually turn into something to be measured, right? The next question is, if you found those, if you think there are some that could be operationalized, what challenges and opportunities do you see to actually measuring the student's sense of belonging in your specific context? This is all a mouthful, so if anybody can even register one of these questions and address it, that's great. We'll take what we can get. And then finally, do you see challenges or opportunities to making any data-driven decisions that could possibly positively impact students and their sense of belonging at your institution? So do you see challenges to those data-driven decisions? What roadblocks are up and what opportunities are there for you to actually access that data and make those decisions? So those are the questions. Anybody got any thoughts?
One thought I had that was not directly related to the question, but to the suggestion that the pillars may have to be reworked, to match the literature. It could be that the pillars are on the forefront and will be trailblazing, and the literature will follow the pillars.
Right. They could also kind of accidentally match the literature too. I think that's kind of what happens when we have pillars that are designed for our specific organization. We're going to have to be a little open. If we're going to try to apply the research that's out there to our organization, we are going to have to be willing to sort of translate that in some way. And maybe that's part of what this, if the Culture Research Center does eventually get stood up, that might be something that they consider, is just translation of this and whatnot.
Well, I'm going to start with the votes. Looks like I see just 4 votes in the chat. I'll start at the top. Yolanda, since you voted for definition number 5, would you want to elaborate on why you felt that was particularly useful for your context? Or any of the voted?
I was going to talk until
somebody says
something.
And
yeah,
I
I'll just run my
saw
mouth.
Masha voted on number 4. Heather voted on number 3, and Jay Garcia on number 1. So
I'm interested in the idea of that, where the difference with us being an online institution versus sort of that physical presence of the surroundings and whatnot. And is there a connection with, because I know that students, I love, when I was attending any online institution, I love the idea that there was a campus that I could go to. And so there was a connection in that way, but it wasn't quite the same as students who have to live in this campus full time,
And that digital space, Dan, that's such an interesting point because, there's our students are together in a classroom in a small cohort at a certain specific time, but maybe not experiencing togetherness with larger groups of students unless they are purposefully seeking student clubs and groups and getting involved. I don't know what the numbers are of what percentage of our students are involved in that, but one of the things in the research that was most interesting to me was the this is a two-way street. And I'm just looking again back at all of these definitions of sense of belonging, and most of them have to do with the student's perception, but that involves some engagement coming from the student, not just what the institution, what we all are doing to engage with them. We're meeting in the middle somewhere.
I think that's an interesting point because I think about, like, for me, like, part of why I would do distance education is because I don't want to belong. I don't want to go to class and sit there and talk with people and interact. And so I hope that this research is asking the question on the front end, not just like, do you feel a sense of belonging, but do you even want to feel a sense of belonging? Because that's really going to impact their ability to feel any sense of belonging. If they don't care about it, they're not taking steps to do it, and that it's not even high on their values list for the institution. Kind of probably an important starting point.
And the benefits might be less for the students who are not seeking that, don't feel that that's important or necessary, don't need that support for whatever reason. Maybe it's less advantageous for success, for academic success than it is for others.
Dr. Dillard mentioned something real quick. I know we're kind of running low on time here. Dr. Dillard mentioned something real quick in the chat in terms of the digital space, that some students who particularly attend online schools specifically because they avoid the face-to-face experience. They're not just like curmudgeons like me. Some people have actually been through trauma where they literally, it's like, this is part of how they navigate where they're at in the world right now because of their challenges and whatnot. And so that's why they took on. So again, going back to like, what's your purpose for being here as a starting point for this stuff? We can't say, oh, so-and-so didn't feel a sense of belonging and that's a bad thing when so-and-so did this to avoid a sense of belonging,
Or I totally agree with that. Thank you for sharing that as well, Dana. And actually, I would see that as actually a strong sense of belonging because of the trauma or whatever those personality differences are, like you described, Dan. A student might feel like this is where I belong because I can be somewhat anonymous, as opposed to I don't belong in a place where I'm going to have constant face-to-face and the instructor is going to be calling on me in front of a whole lot of other people or whatever. So it's kind of how you conceptualize, again, belonging. If it's only conceptualized as engagement, as some do, then we're probably missing the reality of a lot of individuals.
Right. My apologies, an alarm just went off right when I was talking. I noticed Jay Garcia, I'm sorry, I don't see the first name, mentioned that they voted on one because the ideally feeling integral into the organization creates the sense of belonging. So to me, that would point to that it's important for the organization to do the things that make the individual clearly see that the organization sees what they're doing. Because if the organization doesn't give that information back to them, then they're not going to feel valued in the organization, feel like they've done the things that. So that's an interesting thing too to think about, because it's not necessarily the interaction with people in this example, as much as like you're committing something to the organization. You're adding to the organization. If you don't know you're adding it and you don't see that it's valued, then you're not. That's a part of that feedback's missing.
And I'm so glad you added that, because one of the questions that was posed earlier, would we have different definitions for students, faculty, staff, or other contexts as well? Or we might have one student who feels like, well, I belong to too many other things outside of my academics that, especially if we're defining belonging as engagement, I feel like I belong enough. I've heard some students say the equivalent of that, but thank you for also sharing that, Jay.
Especially our students, because like, I belong to a family. That's why I'm doing an online college institution, because I belong to a family. That's where my sense of belonging is met. What I want from this is a credential. You know what I mean? Yeah. So.
And so, getting back to the F word, feel, the more that we can connect and affirm that those types of belongings for our students as well, and that we value, respect, that you have those connections. I think it also communicates to our students that they belong here. And I see Mallory coming back on, so I think she has some closing comments for us. Thank you, Mallory, for your assistance, and for everyone who was present and participated.
Yeah, thank you. This was an amazing session. I just wanted to pop on and just wrap up our session real quick. So I do want to thank Dr. Yolanda Harper, Dr. Stephanie Stubbs, and Dr. Dan Augusto for their presentation. And thank you to the audience for your participation in the session today. I am going to share a link in the chat that is the TLC conference evaluation. So it's just a short survey. If you guys could fill it out, that kind of helps give us feedback on how the experience is going for you. And we're always making improvements for the next year. So I will be pasting that in the chat. But yeah, everyone enjoy the rest of the TLC. And if you do have questions for any of the presenters, feel free to put those in the chat. I can gather them for them. And we also have a few extra minutes if anyone wants to ask them any questions now as well.
Well, thanks, everyone.
Thank you all.
Thank you.